The morning sun filtered through the gymnasium windows as Detective pulled his unmarked police car into the parking lot of Riverside Community Center. It was a Saturday, his day off, but he'd committed months ago to this community demonstration. King, his 8-year-old German Shepherd partner, stood alertly in the back seat, his ears perked up at the familiar sounds of the location. Had been working with King for 6 years now, the longest partnership of his career. They'd solved countless cases together, tracked down dangerous criminals, and worked search and rescue operations that pushed both of them to their physical limits, but knew that King loved these community events the most. There was something about the genuine enthusiasm of children that made the ancient dog's tail wag with pure joy. Clipped King's leash onto his collar and stepped out of the vehicle. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter. Around him, families were arriving, parents holding children's hands, excited kids running ahead, the unmistakable buzz of anticipation. The gymnasium doors were already open, and he could see volunteers from the community center setting up tables and arranging chairs in a large semicircle. This demonstration was part of an annual outreach program that personally led. Over the years, he'd realized that his role as a detective wasn't just about solving crimes or protecting people from criminals. It was also about building community trust, educating the next generation about law enforcement, and showing citizens, especially children, that police officers were approachable, trustworthy figures. As walked King toward the gymnasium entrance, he was greeted warmly by Jennifer, the community center director. She'd organized this event and was beaming with enthusiasm. "Detective, you made it. We have such a great turnout this year. The kids are already excited about seeing King." She reached down to pet King's head, and the dog responded with his characteristic gentleness, allowing her to ruffle his fur. Smiled. Despite his serious work in homicide, he actually enjoyed these community interactions. They reminded him why he'd become a cop in the first place, not for the accolades or the difficult cases, but for moments like this, where he could make a tangible difference in people's lives. The gymnasium was already filling up with families. Scanned the crowd as he and King made their way to the designated demonstration area. There were probably 70 or 80 people there already, with more arriving. Children ranged from toddlers barely able to walk to teenagers who might have thought they were too cool for a police dog presentation, but came anyway. He watched as kids pointed at King, their faces lighting up with wonder and excitement. Several children were asking their parents if they could touch the dog, but had specifically requested that all interactions happen during the designated portion of the presentation, after he'd explained proper safety protocols. That's when his detective's eye caught something unusual. In the far corner of the gymnasium, sitting alone on a metal folding chair, was a little girl. She was small, probably around 3 years old, with thick curly dark hair and chocolate brown eyes. She wore a bright pink dress with white socks and small shoes, but her posture was withdrawn. She clutched a stuffed rabbit so tightly that could see her knuckles were white. Next to her sat a woman, presumably her mother, who had the exhausted, worried expression that had learned to recognize. It was the face of someone carrying trauma, fear, and stress. Investigative instincts, honed by 23 years in law enforcement, began to activate. He'd spent enough time studying human behavior to recognize pain when he saw it. The woman kept glancing around nervously, as if uncomfortable being part of the crowd. The little girl didn't look around with typical childhood curiosity. Instead, her gaze seemed fixed, distant, almost hollow. She didn't engage with the other children playing nearby. She didn't attempt to join the excitement. She simply sat, clutching her stuffed rabbit, looking lost in a room full of people. Made a mental note. During his years as a detective, he'd learned that community events like this often revealed more than people realized. Families came to these demonstrations, and sometimes their personal dynamics told stories that statistics and reports couldn't capture. He wondered what had happened to this little girl to make her so withdrawn, so isolated even in a room full of joyful children. Was it a recent trauma, long-term anxiety, developmental concerns? He didn't know, but his natural inclination to help, the same instinct that had led him into detective work, was activated. Began setting up his demonstration area. He had a PowerPoint presentation on his laptop, some training equipment, a series of photos showing King's training progression, and various tools that police dogs used in their work. Jennifer had arranged for a projector and screen, and soon slides were displayed for everyone to see. He took a moment before starting to look at the gymnasium again. His eyes drifted back to the corner where the little girl and her mother sat. The mother was now looking directly at him, and when their eyes met, she smiled weakly and gave a small wave. Nodded in return, making sure his expression was warm and welcoming. He wanted everyone here, especially that little girl, to feel safe and included. As the gymnasium gradually filled to capacity, with standing room only by the back doors, felt the familiar nervous energy that came before any public presentation. He'd in court dozens of times, given press conferences about major cases, and presented to law enforcement agencies across the state. But there was something uniquely challenging about presenting to a room full of children. They were unpredictable, brutally honest, and impossible to fool or impress through mere authority or credentials. You had to genuinely engage them, keep their attention, and somehow convey complex ideas in ways that made sense to young minds. King seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. The dog sat perfectly still, his leash relaxed in his hands, his posture alert and dignified. This was the dog's moment to shine, and King seemed to understand it. Over the years, King had become more than just a working dog. He was a partner, a friend, and apparently some kind of ambassador for community relations. The dog had an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone needed comfort or encouragement. Glanced one more time toward the corner. The little girl was now watching King intently. Her eyes had changed. The distant, hollow quality was replaced by something sharper, more focused. She was watching King with the intensity of someone recognizing something significant. Felt a strange, prickling sensation run down his spine, that inexplicable detective's intuition that comes when something is about to happen, when the pieces of a puzzle are beginning to align in ways that aren't yet visible. He took a deep breath, smiled at the assembled crowd, and prepared to begin his presentation. But in that moment, couldn't shake the feeling that this particular Saturday demonstration was going to be different from all the others. Something about that little girl's eyes, the way she watched King, the intensity of that gaze, it all suggested that this day was going to change someone's life in ways he couldn't yet predict. "Good morning, everyone," began, his voice carrying across the gymnasium. "I'm Detective, and this is King. We're so glad to be here today to tell you about the incredible work that police dogs do in our community." As he spoke, he noticed the little girl lean forward slightly in her chair. Her grip on the stuffed rabbit loosened just a fraction. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, her expression shifting from worry to something that looked almost like cautious hope. Had no way of knowing it yet, but this moment, this ordinary Saturday morning demonstration, was about to become the beginning of something extraordinary, something that would remind him why he dedicated his life to serving others in the first place. Began his presentation with the natural enthusiasm of someone who had delivered this talk dozens of times but still found genuine joy in it. He started with King's basic background, how the dog had been selected from a specialized breeding program at 8 weeks old, how the training began almost immediately, and how it took nearly 2 years before King was certified for police work. He explained the rigorous standards, the behavioral assessments, and the specialized skills that made dogs like King invaluable to law enforcement agencies across the country. The children listened intently, their eyes wide with fascination as showed photographs of King as a puppy, a young dog in training, and finally, a fully certified police dog. King remained calm and focused throughout the presentation, occasionally glancing up as if acknowledging the human's account of their shared history. The dog's composure was remarkable, had trained him to sit perfectly still for extended periods, to remain unmoved by sudden noises or movements, and to focus on his handler regardless of distractions. This training had proven invaluable during tense situations on the job, but it was equally impressive in these community settings, where a less disciplined dog might have become overstimulated by the attention and excitement. As Spoke, he continued to weave his awareness through the gymnasium. He discussed specific cases where King had helped locate missing persons, tracked down suspects, and detected illegal substances. He made the stories engaging and age-appropriate, careful not to traumatize the younger children with details that were too graphic or disturbing. Instead, he emphasized King's intelligence, his dedication, his remarkable sense of smell, and the bond between a handler and his canine partner. This last point seemed to resonate particularly well. Children were drawn to the idea of such a profound friendship, a partnership based on trust and mutual respect. About 40 minutes into the presentation began the interactive portion. He invited children to approach King in an orderly fashion, explaining the proper way to pet a police dog. "We always ask permission first," he explained to the group. "We're gentle with our hands, we don't grab or pull, and we let the dog come to us. We don't approach the dog suddenly or aggressively." The children formed a line, and one by one they approached King. Each child's face lit up with wonder as they touched the dog's fur, felt his soft ears, and sometimes received a gentle lick on their hand. King was patient and gentle with every single child, never pushing forward aggressively, never snapping, never showing any sign of irritation despite the constant stream of small hands petting him. Watched the line of children move toward King, making sure every interaction was safe and positive. He kept one eye on the corner of the gymnasium, though, where the little girl and her mother remained seated. They hadn't approached, hadn't moved from their isolated spot. The mother looked increasingly anxious, glancing around at the other families participating, seemingly torn between encouraging her daughter to join and respecting the child's obvious resistance. Decided he would address this after the formal interactive portion ended. He didn't want to draw too much attention to them or make the girl feel singled out or pressured. As the line of children gradually diminished and fewer kids remained waiting for their turn with King, noticed something remarkable. The little girl in the corner was moving. Slowly, hesitantly, clutching her stuffed rabbit, she began walking toward King. Her mother's hand reached out as if to stop her, then pulled back, her face a mixture of hope and fear. The girl's movements were careful, deliberate, as if she was walking through water or moving in slow motion. Her eyes never left King's face. Other children had passed by now, and King had returned to his sitting position beside, calm and poised, waiting for the next interaction. The little girl continued her approach, and the gymnasium seemed to grow quieter, as if everyone instinctively recognized that something significant was happening. Held King's leash steady but relaxed, giving the dog no indication of alarm or sudden movement. He simply watched as the girl moved closer, her stuffed rabbit still pressed tightly against her small body. Her mouth was open slightly, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't quite form the words. Then when she was about 5 feet from King, the girl stopped. She extended one small finger pointing directly at the German Shepherd. Her hand trembled. For a moment nothing happened. The gymnasium was absolutely silent. Parents had stopped talking. Children had stopped playing. Even the ambient noise seemed to have faded away. Every eye was on the small girl in the pink dress with the curly dark hair. From her lips came words, 2 simple words, but delivered with such clarity, such certainty, such profound emotion that they seemed to echo through the entire space. "My dog." The words hung in the air like a physical thing. Felt his heart literally skip a beat. The girl's mother gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Several adults in the gymnasium turned to each other with confused expressions, unsure of what they'd just witnessed, but understood instantly. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't imagination. This was recognition. This was a child identifying her beloved companion. Before anyone else could react, King did something remarkable. The dog, who had been sitting calmly throughout the demonstrations, suddenly stood. His entire body shifted in the direction of the girl, without waiting for command, which was unusual as King had been trained to wait for explicit instructions. The dog slowly approached the little girl. His tail wagged gently. His ears were forward, alert, interested. When he reached her, he lowered his massive head and gently licked her hand. The girl's face crumpled. Her stuffed rabbit fell from her grasp, forgotten on the gymnasium floor. She reached out with both hands and buried her face in King's fur, and her entire body began to shake. At first, thought she was crying from fear or distress, but the sounds coming from her were something different. They were sobs, yes, but they were sobs of overwhelming emotion, recognition, relief, joy, confusion, all mixed together in the raw expression of a traumatized child experiencing an unexpected moment of connection. The girl's mother rushed forward, tears streaming down her face. She looked at with an expression of confusion and desperate hope. How did she? Why would she? The mother stammered, unable to complete a coherent sentence. Around the gymnasium, other parents and children watched in stunned silence. Several adults were reaching for tissues. One father had his arm around his wife, both of them appearing deeply moved by what they were witnessing. Moved closer to the mother and daughter, his mind already in detective mode, analyzing the situation, processing the implications. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. A 3-year-old child who'd been silent for months had just spoken 2 words with absolute clarity and certainty. She'd identified a dog she clearly recognized. The mother's reaction suggested this wasn't a trained response or something the child had been coached to do. This was genuine recognition, real emotion, authentic connection. "What's your daughter's name?" asked gently, already beginning to form preliminary theories about what might have happened. "Emma," the mother responded, her voice shaking. "Her name is Emma, but I don't understand. How could she possibly know this dog? We've never brought her here before. She's never seen a police dog demonstration." Looked down at the girl Emma, who was still clinging to King, her body racked with emotion. He looked at King, who remained perfectly still, allowing the child to hold him, to bury her face in his fur, to experience whatever this profound moment meant to her. And in that instant, knew that his day off was over. His comfortable Saturday morning demonstration had transformed into something else entirely. Something that was going to require his detective skills, his persistence, and his determined commitment to finding answers. The gymnasium remained silent, filled with witnesses to an inexplicable moment of connection between a child and a dog, a moment that would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately restore joy to a broken family. The gymnasium had returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the energy in the space had fundamentally shifted. Other families continued to interact with King. Children still approached for their moment of connection with the police dog, but there was an undercurrent of awareness that something extraordinary had occurred in that corner of the gymnasium. Parents whispered to each other, gesturing subtly toward Emma and her mother. Noticed everything, the pointed glances, the hushed conversations, the lingering curiosity. But he focused his attention entirely on the small girl and her mother, realizing that this moment required sensitivity and discretion. Emma had eventually released her grip on King, though the dog remained close to her side, sensing perhaps that this child needed his presence. The girl had sat down on the gymnasium floor, her small body still trembling with emotion, her stuffed rabbit now retrieved and clutched against her chest once more. She hadn't spoken again. Those 2 words seemed to have exhausted some reserve she possessed, but her entire demeanor had shifted. The hollow, distant quality was gone, replaced by something more present, more alive, though still fragile. Completed the formal demonstration portion of the presentation, going through the motions with professional polish while his mind worked through possibilities and questions. He explained police dog tracking techniques, demonstrated King's obedience commands, and discussed the different types of specialized training that dogs could receive. The presentation concluded with the standard question and answer portion, where children raised their hands enthusiastically with inquiries about King's diet, his age, whether he ever got tired, and the inevitable question about whether police dogs could catch bad guys. Answered each question with patience and warmth, all the while maintaining peripheral awareness of Emma and her mother. When the formal presentation concluded and the gymnasium began to empty, families collecting their things, children saying goodbye to King, parents thanking for the demonstration, the detective made his move. He gently guided King toward the corner where Emma and her mother remained. The mother looked nervous, almost as if she wanted to flee, but something in his expression must have communicated that he wasn't approaching with judgment or criticism. He was approaching with genuine curiosity and concern. "Hi there," said, his voice warm and friendly, addressing the mother directly. "I'm Detective, that was. Well, that was something quite remarkable that just happened. I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to talk. I promise this isn't anything official or concerning. I'm just genuinely curious." Sarah, the mother, introduced herself as she stood, glanced down at her daughter, then back at. Tears were still fresh on her face and her hands trembled slightly. "I don't know if I can explain it," she said quietly. "I'm not even sure what just happened. Emma hasn't spoken in 6 months. She hasn't said anything to anyone, not her father, not her sister, not her therapist. And then she just said those words." "Why don't we sit down?" suggested, gesturing toward the gymnasium chairs that were still arranged in the semicircle. He made sure King was positioned comfortably, and the dog seemed to understand that a longer interaction was beginning. The German Shepherd settled onto the floor near Emma, his large body a grounding presence for the traumatized child. Sarah sat down, and the words began to pour out of her like a dam breaking. She explained that Emma's family had lived in a beautiful 2-story home on Maple Street, about 15 minutes from the community center. It had been a normal house with normal family life. Emma, her older sister, both parents, and their beloved German Shepherd, had been with the family for 8 years, having grown up alongside the children. He was gentle, patient, and absolutely devoted to Emma, often sleeping in her room at night as if appointed as her personal guardian. "6 months ago," Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "we had a fire. It started in the kitchen late at night, an electrical issue with the stove that we didn't even know about. We were all sleeping when the smoke alarm went off. My husband got Emma and her sister out through the front door while I called 911. Everyone got out safely. We were all on the lawn when we realized was still inside." Listened intently, his detective's mind already processing the information, already constructing a timeline and understanding the trauma that would follow. "My husband went back in," Sarah continued, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "I screamed at him not to, but he wouldn't listen. He found in the hallway the dog had been trying to find us. He got the dog out, got himself out. The fire department arrived within minutes. Everyone was safe. We were so incredibly lucky. But prompted gently. But in all the chaos, the fire trucks, the emergency responders, the shock of losing our home got away. My husband was helping the firefighters. I was holding both girls and just ran. I think he was scared and confused. By the time we looked for him, he was gone. Animal control came, but they never found him. We went to the local shelters, we checked every facility in the area, we posted flyers everywhere, but there was no trace of him." Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears. The physical trauma of the fire affected Emma, of course, but losing, that broke something inside her. She stopped speaking. She completely. Her therapist said it was selective mutism, a psychological response to trauma. She explained that Emma might not speak again for months or even years. "We've been working with her, trying to help her process the trauma, but nothing seemed to reach her. Nothing broke through." Felt his detective's instincts fully activate. He leaned forward slightly. "Do you remember what shelter animal control took him to? Or do you have any information about where might have ended up?" Sarah shook her head helplessly. "We tried everything. We called animal control multiple times, but they said the records were incomplete from that night. Everything was chaotic. They gave us the names of 3 possible facilities, but when we called, none of them had him in their system. It was like he just vanished. We had to accept that he was probably picked up by someone else, or worse. We had to grieve and move forward for the girl's sake. Glanced at King, then back at Sarah. Did Emma ever mention the breed of dog she wanted to see here today, or did she seem interested in coming to this demonstration? No, Sarah said. That's the strange thing, I almost didn't bring her. Emma doesn't want to do anything, go anywhere, or participate in anything. But our therapist suggested trying new experiences, and I saw the flyer for the police dog demonstration. I thought maybe seeing a dog, something positive and non-threatening, might help her connect with the world again. I didn't think anything would happen. I honestly just wanted to sit in the back and observe, hoping some small part of her might respond positively. I never expected a full verbal response and this level of emotional connection. Finished. He was already thinking ahead, already considering possibilities. King was 8 years old, which was similar in age to what would be now. The breed match was exact. The timing of the fire 6 months ago aligned with the timeline Sarah was providing. The pieces were beginning to fit together, though knew better than to get ahead of himself. Coincidence existed. Mistakes could be made. But his instincts, honed through 23 years of investigation, were telling him something significant. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to describe to me in as much detail as possible. Physical markings, distinctive features, anything that would make him uniquely identifiable. Sarah's eyes widened with hope and fear in equal measure. Why, do you think? Do you think you might be able to find him? I don't want to make promises I can't keep, said carefully. But I'm going to try. First, tell me everything about. As Sarah began describing her family's lost dog, the tan and black markings, the small white patch on his chest, the scar on his left ear from a puppy incident, the way his tail curled slightly at the tip, felt that familiar sensation that came when a case was truly about to begin. He looked down at Emma, who was still silently watching King with an intensity that suggested she was communicating something profound that words couldn't express. Don't worry, said quietly, more to himself than to Sarah. If he's out there, we're going to find him. I promise you that. That night, sat at his kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee beside him and his laptop open to multiple browser windows. King rested his graying muzzle on his lap, occasionally releasing a soft sigh, as if understanding that his partner had embarked on some personal mission that would consume the evening. The detective's home was quiet. His ex-wife had moved out 3 years ago, his daughter was grown and living on the West Coast, and he'd never. His life was his work, and increasingly his work had become his life. But tonight his work wasn't the homicide cases piling up on his desk at the precinct. Tonight his work was finding a lost German shepherd named. Had changed out of his official presentation clothes and into comfortable sweats and an old police academy t-shirt. His detective's notebook lay open beside him, filled with information Sarah had provided. Full physical description, distinguishing marks, approximate age, breed confirmation, and the approximate date of the fire, April 17th of this year. The fire had occurred on a Tuesday night, and according to the firefighters' report that Sarah had eventually obtained, animal control had been called around 2:47 a.m. But the official records of where had been taken were mysteriously incomplete. Began his research methodically, as he'd been trained to do in countless investigations. He opened the website for the local animal control facility first, scrolling through their current roster of available dogs. No, he checked their archived records from the period around mid-April. The system was poorly organized, with gaps in the data and inconsistent record-keeping. He made a note to follow up with a phone call in the morning. Moving on, he accessed the websites of 3 major animal shelters within a 15-mile radius of where the fire had occurred. He searched their current dogs, looked at their historical records, and cross-referenced with any German shepherds that might have arrived in April or May. Nothing. Leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers on the table. This was frustrating but not unexpected. The animal welfare system, despite the best intentions of the people who worked within it, was notoriously underfunded and poorly organized in many areas. Records went missing. Dogs were transferred between facilities without proper documentation. Volunteers entered information inconsistently. A dog could literally disappear into the system, especially during a period of crisis when animal control was responding to an active fire scene. He pulled out his phone and opened his contact list. He had friends and professional connections throughout the city, other detectives, police officers, even some animal control officers he'd worked with on missing persons cases where dogs had been involved. He began texting them, starting with a simple message. "Hey, long shot, but I'm looking for a German Shepherd that was picked up by animal control around April 17th. Do you have any leads or contacts that might help me track this down?" The responses came trickling in over the next hour. Some friends didn't reply until morning. Others provided suggestions. Try calling the county facility. There's a no-kill shelter about 20 minutes north. I know a guy who works dispatch for animal control. I can pass along your number. Methodically collected every lead, writing them all down in his notebook, creating a network of possibilities to investigate. By midnight, had compiled a list of 17 different animal facilities within a 100-mile radius, 17 places where might have ended up. Some were official city shelters. Others were private, non-profit rescue organizations. A few were rural facilities that took in strays from outlying areas. It was a daunting list, but had investigated cold cases with less. He had the patience for this. He had the determination. He got up from the table and walked to his refrigerator, grabbing a bottle of water. King followed him, his tail wagging hopefully, perhaps thinking this indicated that bedtime was approaching, but wasn't ready for sleep. His mind was too active, his thoughts spinning with possibilities. He returned to the table and began making notes about his investigation strategy. "First thing tomorrow," he said aloud to King, who tilted his head at the sound of his voice, "I'm going to start calling. I'll start with the ones closest to the fire location and work outward. I'll describe in detail. I'll ask about their record-keeping systems. I'll find this dog." King rested his head back on his lap, and the detective began typing up a formal description of, including all the identifying characteristics that Sarah had provided. He created a digital file with photos that Sarah had texted him, pictures of from the family's smartphone, showing the dog in happier times, playing in the yard, sitting with Emma, his scar visible on his left ear, his unique tail curl evident in one of the photos. Around 1:30 a.m., finally closed his laptop. He was exhausted but wired, his detective's mind unable to fully shut down. He let King out into the backyard for his final bathroom break of the evening, then set up everything he would need for the morning. His phone on the charger, his notebook beside his bed on the nightstand, his list of 17 facilities printed and ready. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, thought about Emma. He thought about a 3-year-old girl who hadn't spoken in 6 months, who had lost everything in a fire, and who had somehow recognized another dog as a reminder of her lost best friend. He thought about Sarah, a desperate mother trying to help her traumatized child. He thought about a loyal dog who had tried to protect his family and then been separated from them in the chaos of an emergency. And he thought about his career in law enforcement. 23 years of investigating human cruelty, human tragedy, human violence. 23 years of pursuing justice for victims who couldn't speak for themselves. But in all those years, had he ever pursued anything that felt as genuinely important as this? This wasn't about solving a crime. This wasn't about justice or prosecution or putting bad people behind bars. This was about restoring joy, about healing trauma, about giving a broken family another chance at wholeness. Understood in that moment, lying in the darkness, that he was about to embark on something that might seem insignificant to his colleagues. A homicide detective spending his time looking for a lost dog. It would probably be ridiculed if word got out, but didn't care. He'd learned in his years as a detective that the most meaningful work wasn't always the most obvious work. Sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply show up, pay attention, and refuse to give up. The next morning woke at 5:30 a.m. before his alarm even sounded. He showered, dressed, made strong coffee, and settled at his kitchen table with his phone and his list. He had called the first facility by 6:47 a.m., before most of the city was even awake. The conversation was polite but ultimately unhelpful. The shelter had no German Shepherd's matching description in their current records or their archived records from April. Hung up and immediately dialed the second number. And that was how it began, an investigation that would consume his nights and his weekends, that would drive his colleagues to shake their heads in bemusement, that would lead him down unexpected paths and through countless dead ends. But didn't know any of this yet. All he knew was that he had 17 facilities to call, and he wasn't going to stop until he found, or until he'd exhausted every possible lead. King sensed the shift in his partner. The dog sat attentively, as if understanding that something significant was. Together, detective and dog settled in for what would become the most important case of his career, not because it would make headlines or advance his career, but because it would restore something infinitely precious to a family that had lost so much. 3 weeks had passed since began his investigation. 23 days of phone calls, dead ends, false leads, and mounting frustration. He had systematically worked through his list of 17 facilities, calling each one multiple times, speaking with shelter directors, volunteer coordinators, adoption counselors, and veterinary staff. He had faxed photographs of. He had described the dog's physical characteristics so many times that he could do it in his sleep. He had driven to 7 different facilities in person, walking through kennels and looking at every German Shepherd housed there, his heart sinking each time he realized none of them were. His colleagues at the precinct had begun to notice his divided attention. His lieutenant had commented during a briefing that seemed distracted. "Everything okay?" the lieutenant had asked, his eyes narrowing with concern, had simply nodded and assured him that he was fine, that he was just working through a personal matter in his off hours. He didn't elaborate. He didn't mention the lost dog, the traumatized child, or the obsessive search that was consuming his evenings and weekends. Some things didn't need to be explained to the professional hierarchy. King had become his constant companion during this investigation. The German Shepherd seemed to understand the urgency of the mission. He would sit attentively while made phone calls, his ears perking up at the sound of his partner's voice becoming more animated or discouraged. When drove to different shelters, King would accompany him, resting in the back seat, as if offering silent support for the search. Had developed a system for tracking his calls. In his notebook, he had created a matrix with each facility's name, contact information, phone number, multiple call dates, and notes about each conversation. Beside each entry, he had marked whether that facility had been ruled out or whether it still remained a possibility. The notebook had become a testament to his determination, page after page of careful documentation, each entry a small piece of the larger puzzle. He had hit a significant dead end around day 10. The county animal control facility had a major computer system upgrade in June, and many records from April had been transferred to a backup system that was difficult to access. Had spent an entire afternoon on hold, being transferred between departments, finally speaking with someone who informed him that the backup system was temporarily unavailable due to technical issues. He had had to accept that he might not get answers from official animal control for several more weeks. But was not a detective who gave up when blocked. Instead, he expanded his search. He contacted rescue organizations, breed-specific German Shepherd rescue groups, and even private individuals who worked in dog rehabilitation and fostering. One particularly helpful volunteer named at a German Shepherd rescue organization had spent nearly an hour on the phone with, discussing the common ways that dogs ended up in various facilities, the transfer protocols between shelters, and the likelihood that a dog picked up by animal control during a fire emergency might have been transported to a specific regional facility. If I were animal control responding to that fire, had explained, and I picked up a dog, I might not have taken him to the main city facility. Depending on how overwhelmed they were that night, I might have taken him to the regional facility north of the city. They handle overflow during emergencies. This single piece of advice had Ben's turning point. He had immediately added 3 regional facilities to his list and begun calling them with renewed urgency. The first 2 yielded nothing, but the third facility, a county animal welfare center about 40 minutes north of the city, had a director named Robert who seemed to understand exactly what was asking for. A German Shepherd picked up around mid-April, Robert had repeated over the phone. During that time period, we were processing overflow from the city. Our record-keeping was absolutely chaotic. We were understaffed, overwhelmed. But let me check our backup files. What's the dog's name again? Had said, his heart beginning to race with a cautious hope that he'd learned to temper through 3 weeks of disappointment. Okay, I'm going to put you on a brief hold. This might take a few minutes. Our archived system is slow, but I can search by approximate intake date and breed. Had held his breath during those interminable minutes. King had lifted his head from where he was resting, as if sensing the change in his partner's energy. When Robert returned to the phone, his voice had carried a note of uncertainty. I think I might have something. We have a German Shepherd that came in around mid-April. The intake report is vague, it just says stray pickup during fire emergency response. No name listed, which is why he's hard to track. The dog's description is, let me read this. Tan and black coloring, approximately 8 years old at intake, no microchip registered, some scarring on left ear. Does that match? Had to set down his phone for a moment. His hands were shaking. Yes, he had finally managed to say. Yes, that matches. What's his current status? He's still here, Robert had said. I'm looking at the notes. The dog was initially flagged for adoption after the standard hold period, but he had some behavioral issues, anxiety, possibly related to trauma, so he wasn't immediately adopted. He went into our long-term care program. We actually just did a reassessment of him last week because we were considering special placement. He's been a model resident for the last several months. The behavioral issues seem to have resolved. He's calm, well-trained, very gentle. We were thinking he might be a good candidate for a therapy dog placement. Had felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. I need to see this dog. When can I come? We're open until 6 p.m. today. It's 4:15 now. You can definitely make it if you leave right away. Had ended the call and immediately started moving. He had put King in the car, the irony not lost on him that he was driving his own German Shepherd partner to potentially meet another German Shepherd who might be, and had driven with his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. The shelter facility was clean and well organized, surprisingly different from expectations. A staff member named Jennifer had met him at the entrance and guided him through the kennels. His heart pounded with each step. They had walked past numerous dogs, each one receiving a brief glance from before he dismissed them as not. Here he is, Jennifer had finally said, stopping at a particular kennel. And had seen him. The dog was unmistakable. Tan and black coloring, the distinctive scar on his left ear, the unique curl to his tail that was visible even as the dog stood calmly in his kennel. When called out the name, the dog's entire body had transformed. His tail had wagged with increasing intensity. His eyes had brightened. He had stood and pressed himself against the fence, clearly recognizing something in his voice or presence that connected to his past. Had knelt down and the dog had pushed his nose through the fence, allowing to touch him. The detective had felt the familiar warmth of a canine connection, the same way King responded to him after long days apart. This was, no question, no doubt. This is the one, had said to Jennifer, his voice thick with emotion. This is absolutely the one I've been looking for. Jennifer had looked confused. You know this dog? Not personally, had explained. But I know someone who loves him very much, and I have a 3-year-old girl who hasn't spoken in 6 months who's going to be thrilled to meet him again. The paperwork had taken time but had pushed it through as quickly as possible. As a police officer, he had had legitimate authority to expedite certain processes. By 5:47 p.m., just 13 minutes before the shelter closed, had signed the final adoption papers. Was officially his, pending the standard adoption period, but more importantly was coming home with. Sitting in the car afterward with King in the back seat and in the passenger seat looking confused and shell-shocked by the change in his circumstances, had allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. 3 weeks of investigation, 17 facilities, countless phone calls, and finally success. He had driven directly to his home, given both dogs water and a light meal, and then sat down to draft the message to Sarah that would set the final part of this incredible journey in motion. Had spent the entire evening composing his message to Sarah. He had drafted it multiple times, trying to find the right words that would convey both the enormity of what he had accomplished and the emotional weight of what was about to happen. Finally, he had settled on a simple text. I found him. Is safe. Can I bring him by tomorrow afternoon? There's something I want to show Emma. Sarah's response had come within seconds, 3 words that carried a universe of hope and disbelief. Are you serious? Had called her, explaining the entire 3-week investigation, the phone calls to 17 facilities, the dead ends that had eventually led him to advice about regional facilities, and finally, Robert's discovery of in the county shelter system. Sarah had wept through most of the conversation, alternating between joy and guilt for not being able to find herself, between hope and fear that this was somehow a mistake or that something would go wrong. It's real, had assured her. I have him. He's here with me right now. He's safe and he's waiting to see Emma. The next morning had taken both German shepherds to a local grooming facility. He wanted to look his best for the reunion, wanted the dog to be comfortable and presented well. He had also wanted to give himself time to think, to prepare, to understand the emotional significance of what was about to unfold. King had accompanied through the grooming process, the 2 dogs together almost like brothers, providing each other with quiet support. By 2:30 p.m., was driving towards Sarah's temporary apartment within the passenger seat. The dog was alert, his ears perked up, his body language suggesting that he sensed something significant was about to happen. Had explained the situation to as if the dog could understand, which, in some ineffable way, believed he could. Your girl is waiting for you, had said during the drive. She's been waiting a very long time. She hasn't spoken since you got separated, but I think she might speak again when she sees you. I think you have that power. Sarah met at the apartment door, her face a mixture of emotions too complex to name. Behind her, visible in the dim hallway, was Emma. The little girl was wearing a yellow dress, her curly hair carefully brushed, her stuffed rabbit held tight against her body. She appeared curious but cautious, her eyes moving from to the leash in his hand and what was attached to it. Emma said gently, I brought someone here to see you, someone very special, someone I think you've been missing very much. He stepped aside, bringing fully into view. For a moment, absolutely nothing happened. Emma stared at the dog, stared back at the girl. The moment stretched out, eternal and suspended, as if the entire universe was holding its breath. Then moved. The dog pulled forward gently on his leash, not aggressively, but with purpose and recognition. His tail began to wag with increasing intensity. He made a soft, whimpering sound, not a bark, but a sound of emotional connection, a vocalization that seemed to express recognition and longing and overwhelming joy. Emma's mouth opened slightly. Her eyes went wide. For a frozen moment, wondered if the trauma was too much, if Emma would freeze or become frightened. But then the stuffed rabbit fell from her hands, forgotten and uncared for on the apartment floor. Emma whispered, her voice barely audible, tentative, as if she wasn't entirely sure she was allowed to speak. "Yes," said softly, he's come back to you." Emma released a sound, a cry that was part confusion, part joy, part overwhelming emotion that had no name. She lunged forward and wrapped her small arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. The dog responded immediately, his entire body trembling with emotion. He licked her face repeatedly, gently but persistently, as if trying to reassure himself that this was real, that his girl was actually here, that the separation had truly ended. Sarah collapsed against the doorframe, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, felt his own eyes growing wet. King, sensing the emotional intensity, moved closer to Emma, and his presence somehow grounding and supportive to the reunion unfolding before him. For several minutes, nothing was said. Emma simply held Emma with the fierce devotion of a dog who had been separated from his beloved child, a dog who had waited in an anonymous shelter, a dog who had been restored to wholeness through the determination of a stranger who had believed that love and connection mattered more than professional cynicism. He's really here," Sarah finally managed to ask, her voice shaking. "He's really ours again." "He's really yours," confirmed. "It took some work to track him down, but he's been in the county shelter system this whole time. A clerical error buried his intake records, but he's here now, and he's ready to come home with you." Emma finally looked up her face tear-stained and radiant. She looked with an intensity that suggested she understood, on some fundamental level, that this man had given her back something precious. "Thank you," Emma said, her voice small but clear. 2 words, different words than she had spoken at the gymnasium, but no less transformative in their power. Knelt down so that he was at eye level with Emma. "You know what? I think you did the real work. When you recognized King at that demonstration, you spoke those 2 words. That took tremendous courage from someone so brave. And because you spoke, because you told us about, I was able to find him." Emma considered this, her 3-year-old mind processing the information in the way that children do, with a mixture of logic and intuition that often exceeds adult comprehension. She reached out and touched his face with one small hand, as if making sure he was real, as if understanding the significance of what he had done for her. Over the next hour, watched as Emma reunited with the family. Sarah's husband arrived home from work, and his expression of shock and joy was profound. Emma's older sister cried when she saw, hugging the dog with the same intensity that Emma had. The apartment became a space filled with tears and laughter and overwhelming gratitude. When it came time to leave, Emma didn't want to let him go. She held onto his hand, looking up at him with eyes that seemed to contain more wisdom than her 3 years should have contained. "Will you come visit us?" she asked. "Of course," said. "I'll visit you and whenever you'd like. We're friends now, remember." As drove away from the apartment with King beside him, his heart felt fuller than it had in years. He thought about his career, about all the cases he had solved, all the criminals he had put away, all the professional accolades he had received. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the feeling of having reunited a traumatized child with her beloved companion. Nothing compared to witnessing the moment when a broken family became whole again. King rested his head on shoulder, as if understanding that something profound had just occurred, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of police work and detective duty. It was love, pure and simple. It was connection. It was proof that sometimes the most important cases were the ones that had nothing to do with crime and everything to do with compassion. Dr. Mitchell, Emma's child psychologist, sat across from Sarah in her small office exactly 1 month after the reunion with. The therapist's expression was one of cautious amazement, a professional countenance attempting to maintain objectivity while processing what she was witnessing in her patient's transformation. "The progress Emma has made in the past 4 weeks is, frankly, unprecedented in my experience," Dr. Mitchell said, adjusting her glasses and referencing her detailed notes. When I last saw her 6 weeks ago, I was discussing with you the possibility that her selective mutism might persist for an extended period, potentially years. I was recommending ongoing therapy, possibly medication, and managing expectations for a gradual recovery. But what I'm seeing now is nothing short of remarkable. Sarah listened intently, still somewhat in disbelief at the change that had occurred in her daughter. She talks constantly now, Sarah said, a smile spreading across her face. Sometimes I have to remind her to take a breath. She tells me about everything, her dreams, things she sees, things she wants to do. This morning she sang while eating breakfast. Sang. I didn't think I'd ever hear her sing again. The neurobiological impact of emotional connection and trauma recovery is profound, Dr. Mitchell explained. Emma experienced acute trauma from the house fire, the fear, the displacement, the sensory overload. But the secondary trauma of losing compounded that significantly. Children process emotions through connection, and when Emma lost her primary source of comfort and security, she retreated inward. Her inability to speak wasn't a defect or a permanent condition. It was her mind's protective mechanism. And return reverse that? Sarah asked, understanding the mechanism but still finding it difficult to fully comprehend the dramatic shift. Not just reversed it, activated healing mechanisms that hadn't previously been accessible, Dr. Mitchell said. When Emma reconnected with, she wasn't just reconnecting with a beloved pet. She was reconnecting with proof that lost things could be found again, that safety could be restored, that the world wasn't as chaotic and uncontrollable as the trauma had suggested. Became a physical embodiment of hope. Over the following weeks, Sarah witnessed the continuing transformation of her daughter. Emma had become increasingly confident and engaged. She'd started attending a preschool program with enthusiasm, something she had previously refused to do. She made friends with other children, participated in group activities, and demonstrated none of the social anxiety that had characterized her behavior for the previous 6 months. More impressively, she had begun to process her memories of the fire in healthy ways. One afternoon, Sarah had found Emma drawing pictures with crayons. The pictures showed a house on fire, but significantly, they also showed people and animals outside the house, safe and together. This was progress. Emma was processing her trauma through creative expression, integrating the frightening experience into her narrative without allowing it to define her. Had become Emma's emotional anchor. The dog seemed to understand his role instinctively. When Emma experienced any moment of anxiety or fear, would position himself close to her, his large body a grounding presence. When nightmares came in the darkness of night, would wake and move to Emma's bed, his presence dispelling the terrors of her subconscious. The dog's behavioral issues, the anxiety and trauma responses that the shelter staff had noted, seemed to have completely resolved now that he was reunited with his child. Had made good on his promise to visit. He came by the apartment approximately once a week, sometimes with King, always bringing treats for and usually some small gift for Emma, a coloring book, a toy, a new stuffed animal to add to her collection. These visits became anticipated events. Emma would ask her mother in advance, "Is Detective coming today? Is King coming?" Her anticipation demonstrated a child who was developing healthy attachments and normal social connections. During one visit, Emma had asked a question that had struck him deeply. "Why did you help me find?" Had sat down at Emma's level, just as he had done in her apartment a month earlier. "Because when I saw you look at King at the gymnasium, I saw someone who loved very much and was hurting very much. And I couldn't ignore that. That's kind of what being a detective is about, paying attention to things that matter, and then doing something about them." "You're a good detective," Emma had said solemnly, her 3-year-old wisdom capturing something essential about what was learning about himself. By week 6 after the reunion, Sarah felt comfortable enough to attempt something she hadn't dared to do in months, taking Emma to the community center. She was nervous, afraid that returning to the location of Emma's trauma might trigger negative responses. But Emma surprised her. "I want to go see the place where I said those 2 words about," Emma explained with her now characteristic clarity. "I want to tell the people there that my dog is home." The community center director, Jennifer, was thrilled to see Emma return. She had been one of the witnesses to the remarkable moment at the gymnasium, and she followed the story with genuine interest. Emma, now speaking freely and with confidence, told the story of finding to anyone who would listen. She explained about the fire, about losing her dog, about the man with the police dog who helped her find him again. "This is the most remarkable story," Jennifer said to Sarah. "What detective did for your family, it's inspiring. Have you thought about sharing this story more widely? I think people need to hear about this." Sarah had mentioned this conversation to during his next visit. The detective had initially been reluctant. "This isn't about me," he'd said. "This is about Emma and their family. I don't need recognition." "But it's not just about that," Sarah had insisted. "It's about what you did. It's about showing people that sometimes caring about something beyond your job description, doing something that might seem insignificant professionally, can change someone's entire life. I think other people need to know that." Had considered this, and he'd agreed that Sarah could speak to a local news outlet about the story. He hadn't anticipated the response that would follow. The story had been published in the local news section first, with a modest headline: "Detective reunites traumatized child with lost family dog." But the story had resonated with readers in unexpected ways. It was shared on social media. People commented about their own experiences with lost pets, about their own traumas and recoveries, about the power of connection and compassion. Within a week, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets. Within 2 weeks, national media had become interested. Had done 2 interviews and turned down dozens of others. He'd wanted to maintain privacy and avoid the sensation-seeking aspect of the story. But the narrative was powerful, and people couldn't resist sharing it. Emma became a minor celebrity in her community. The family was invited to speak at local events, was featured in an animal shelter fundraising campaign. But the most significant change wasn't the publicity. It was what happened inside Emma's mind and heart. The little girl who hadn't spoken in 6 months had transformed into a confident, joyful child who spoke freely, laughed easily, and played with genuine enthusiasm. Her therapist noted that the trauma symptoms had essentially resolved. She no longer exhibited signs of anxiety, had no persistent nightmares, and demonstrated resilience in her approach to life. "Emma has integrated the trauma experience into her larger life narrative," Dr. Mitchell explained to Sarah in their final session before transitioning to quarterly check-ins. "She understands that she survived something difficult, but she also understands that she wasn't defined by that difficulty. She has to anchor her. She has you and your family, and apparently she has Detective and King, who have become important figures in her support network. This is what genuine healing looks like." One evening, as sat in the apartment with the family, watching Emma play with while King rested nearby, Sarah had expressed her gratitude in words that would stay with him forever. "You gave my daughter her voice back. You gave our family our wholeness back. There's no way to thank you for that adequately." Had simply smiled and watched Emma giggle as licked her face, watched the joy radiating from the child, and understood that the thanks wasn't what mattered. What mattered was this moment, this living, breathing proof that one person's compassion could literally transform a life, that love and connection could heal even the deepest wounds, that sometimes the most important detective work had nothing to do with solving crimes and everything to do with restoring joy. 9 months after the reunion, sat in his office at the police precinct when his lieutenant knocked on the door. Captain entered with a peculiar expression, part pride, part amusement, part something else that couldn't quite identify. "You need to see this," said, placing a newspaper on the desk. The headline read, "Detectives' Compassion Sparks Community Initiative. Police Officers Search for Lost Dog Inspires Shelter Reform Movement." The article, appearing in the Sunday edition of the city's largest newspaper, told the story of a 3-week investigation and Emma's subsequent transformation. But more significantly, it detailed the broader impact the story had generated. Read through the article with growing surprise. The piece discussed how Emma's story had reached Dr. Harold, no relation, the director of the state's Animal Welfare Oversight Committee. Inspired by what he read about the clerical errors and record-keeping failures that had allowed to disappear into the system, Doctor had launched a comprehensive review of animal shelter protocols across the state. "That's not all," said, gesturing to the article. "Keep reading." The article continued, explaining that the review had identified systemic problems in multiple facilities. More importantly, it had led to the development of new standardized protocols for record-keeping, animal intake processing, and database management. Several shelters had already implemented the new systems. The article quoted the state director of animal welfare. "Detectives' investigation highlighted critical failures in our system that we were overlooking. One lost dog led to a comprehensive review that has already improved outcomes for hundreds of animals and will eventually improve outcomes for thousands. This is exactly the kind of citizen engagement that drives positive systemic change." Felt his heart quicken as he continued reading. The article noted that funding had been allocated for staff training, technology upgrades, and the creation of a centralized statewide database that would track animals across facility systems, preventing future cases from falling through bureaucratic cracks. "The city council is thinking about giving you a formal commendation," said, leaning against the desk. "Chief wants to do something public, maybe a ceremony. You'll probably get some media attention if you agree to it." Set down the newspaper, his mind processing the unexpected consequences of what had begun as a simple personal mission. "I don't need a commendation," he said. "I did what I thought was right." "I know you did," replied. "But sometimes doing what's right has ripple effects that deserve recognition. You didn't just find a dog, you changed a system. You've potentially saved countless animals from disappearing like did." Over the following months, watched as the story continued to evolve and expand in ways he'd never anticipated. The local animal shelter, inspired by the positive publicity surrounding recovery, had launched a special initiative called Second Chances, Finding Lost Companions. The program employed volunteers to systematically search for lost animals in shelter systems, focusing particularly on cases where records might be incomplete or where animals had been transferred between facilities. Was asked to be the program's honorary advisor. He declined any formal position but agreed to lend his name and occasionally volunteer his time. On one Saturday morning, he brought King to the shelter to help train volunteers in what he called investigative pet recovery, teaching them how to think like detectives, how to ask the right questions, how to follow leads that seemed insignificant. Emma had become the program's unofficial mascot. At 4 years old now, exactly 1 year after the gymnasium demonstration, she understood, in her childlike way, that she had become part of something larger than herself. She participated in shelter fundraising events, talking to other children about the importance of not giving up on lost pets, about how love and persistence could restore families that had been torn apart. One afternoon, Sarah brought Emma to a fundraising event at the shelter. The little girl stood beside her, telling her story to a room full of potential donors and animal welfare advocates. Sitting in the back of the room with King, felt tears forming as he watched this child, who hadn't spoken 6 months earlier, confidently narrate her experience to an audience of adults. "My dog was lost," Emma explained with remarkable clarity for a 4-year-old. "My family was very sad. Detective found him because he didn't give up, and now is home and I'm happy again. I want to help other kids find their dogs because nobody should be as sad as I was." The room erupted in applause. Several people in the audience were openly crying. Sarah stood behind Emma, her own face wet with tears, her hand on her daughter's shoulder, pride evident in every line of her body. The impact extended beyond the animal welfare system. Emma's story had resonated with trauma therapists and child psychologists, who began citing the case in professional literature as an example of how attachment figures, whether human or animal, could serve as healing agents for traumatized children. Dr. Mitchell had been invited to present Emma's case study, with appropriate anonymity modifications, at several professional conferences, discussing the neurobiology of trauma recovery and the role of animal companionship in therapeutic contexts. Received calls from police departments in other cities asking for advice on how to conduct similar searches for lost animals. He developed a basic training curriculum that other law enforcement agencies could implement, emphasizing the importance of cross-agency cooperation and systematic investigation methods. What had begun as one detective's personal mission had become a framework that other officers were adopting across the country. The most unexpected consequence came 8 months after the reunion, when was contacted by a documentary filmmaker interested in creating a short film about the story. After significant consideration and consultation with Sarah and the family, had agreed. The resulting documentary, titled 2 Words, premiered at a regional film festival and had eventually been picked up by a streaming service for national distribution. Watching the documentary, which featured interviews with Sarah, Emma, Dr. Mitchell, and various animal welfare officials, was struck by the universality of the themes. It wasn't just a story about finding a lost dog. It was a story about the power of compassion, about refusing to accept that something lost must remain lost, about the profound connections between humans and animals, about systemic change arising from individual action. The documentary had generated significant public awareness about animal shelter issues. Shelters across the country reported increased volunteer participation following the film's release. Adoption rates increased. Funding for animal welfare programs expanded. And most significantly, the conversation about animal welfare shifted from something peripheral to something central to discussions about community care and responsibility. By the 1-year anniversary of the gymnasium demonstration, had settled into a new rhythm. His detective work continued. Unsolved homicides didn't pause for personal missions, but something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of his role and purpose. He still worked cases, still pursued justice, still operated within the structures of law enforcement. But he'd also learned that sometimes the most important work happened outside official channels, driven by compassion rather than obligation. Emma started kindergarten that fall, confident and articulate, her selective mutism completely resolved. Remained her constant companion, the two moving through the world with the comfortable synchronicity of souls that understood each other perfectly. The family had moved into a new, permanent home, a house with a large backyard where could run and play, where Emma could grow without the shadows of trauma dominating her experience. Continued visiting regularly. He brought King, who had become his closest friend despite being technically on opposite sides of the law enforcement and rescue divide. Sarah had stopped trying to thank him. She'd learned that experienced gratitude differently than most people. He didn't need words or gestures. He simply needed to see Emma happy, to see thriving, to know that the work of his hands and heart had mattered. On the anniversary of the reunion, stood in the backyard of Emma's new home, watching the 2 dogs play while Emma laughed and ran between them. King was getting older, his muzzle graying, his movements slightly slower, but his joy in Emma's presence was undiminished. Fully recovered from his shelter trauma, was the embodiment of resilience and second chances. Reflected on something he'd read in a book once, that the purpose of life wasn't to achieve great things or make grand gestures. It was simply to help where help was needed, to love where love was needed, to show up and do the work that mattered, even when that work seemed small or insignificant in the grand scheme of things. He had done that. He had shown up. He had refused to accept the comfortable narrative that some things were lost forever. And in doing so, he had discovered that the smallest acts of compassion could create the largest ripples, that one person's determination to help could reshape systems and transform lives. As the sun set over the backyard, casting long shadows across the grass, understood that this moment of peace and joy, this family restored, this child healed, this love renewed, this was the greatest case he would ever solve. Not because it would advance his career or generate headlines, but because it mattered. It mattered deeply, profoundly, eternally. And that, he realized, was enough, more than enough. It was everything.